Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our first lesson on the topic of enzymes. And you might be wondering why I've placed this picture of a lock and key and a jigsaw puzzle here on this first slide. Well, as we'll see, the way that enzymes work is similar to how a lock and key works. So hold that thought in your mind even as we go through the rest of this lesson. But first, you might be wondering what this topic on enzymes has to do with your life anyway. Well, have you ever stained your clothes after a meal? Uh, you know, you're eating that mee rebus and then suddenly the sauce just splurts all over your shirt. And very bad, especially if your shirt is all white. Now, what do you do when you've got your shirt stained like this? I'm sure some of you would say just pass it to mommy and daddy to deal with it. But hopefully some of you help with housework at home, so you'll say let's just put it in the wash and deal with it. Well, if you're one of those cool kids who helps with the laundry at home, then you'll be quite familiar with washing detergents. Like this one here, Persil, which is the brand that I use. I found that it comes in two forms. So do you see the difference between this blue box and the green box, besides the color? Oh, you might have seen that this is the non-bio version and this is the bio version of the washing powder. And this on the right is the biological powder. I was curious to see what the ingredients are in the biological powder, so I took a look at the tab. And lo and behold, besides all these other words that I don't really understand, there was an ingredient called enzymes. And so it struck me that enzymes are actually very relevant to our daily life, right? They're actually used to clean the stains off of our clothes so that we can come to school with nice, clean uniforms. Right, but first, let's look at what are enzymes anyway. Alright, so in the first part of this lesson, we'll be looking at what are enzymes and how do enzymes work. In particular, how do we explain them and their effect on activation energy. And finally, what are the different types of enzymes? So if you're following your textbook, this is from page 72 to 76. Now I'd like to start off with this interesting experiment involving hydrogen peroxide. You find it here, there's a beaker of hydrogen peroxide here, and normally what happens is it breaks down into oxygen, so you see bubbles coming out, and water. Now take a look at this at the start. And you realize that hydrogen peroxide is not breaking down very fast at all. But add a bit of blood to it, and what do you notice? Well, you start to see lots and lots of bubbles of oxygen gas being produced. So here's the conclusion that people have taken away from this experiment. It is that blood seems to contain a substance that speeds up the breakdown of hydrogen peroxide. Now take note of this idea of speeding up of reactions. Okay, this idea of speeding up of reactions is important to the idea of enzymes. So with that in mind, what I would like you to do now is do a simple reading task. Take a look at your textbook, page 72, and try to answer the questions on your notes as to what is a catalyst, what is an enzyme, and what is the difference between a catalyst and an enzyme. Alright, off to your reading now. So hopefully in your reading you found out that a catalyst is a substance that speeds up a chemical reaction while itself remaining unchanged chemically at the end of the reaction. And enzymes, well, they are a kind of catalyst. They are biological catalysts, so they are found in biological systems like our body, and they are proteins. They also speed up chemical reactions while remaining chemically unchanged at the end of the reaction. Now, I cannot emphasize how important this definition is. You do need to get it into your heads because it's often asked in your exams. Now, here's an example of enzyme activity. In our last topic, we learned about maltose, and we learned that it was made up of 2 units of glucose. Now, maltose can be broken down into glucose, but this happens very, very slowly at room temperature. Now, one way of speeding it up would be to just heat maltose very, very strongly at high temperature with acid. This would cause maltose to break down. Now, there is another way of doing this so that you can break down maltose at room temperature. And the way of breaking down maltose at room temperature is to just add some enzymes, maltase enzyme. So just by adding this enzyme, it speeds up the breakdown of maltose into glucose. without having to raise the temperature. Now this actually has something to do with why we need enzymes, because the breakdown of maltose to glucose is something that actually happens in our bodies. Right? We need to break down maltose to glucose so that we can use the glucose to get energy. This is part of digestion. But looking at these two methods, heating strongly with acid versus using an enzyme, which method do you think is more possible or better in the human body? Now, it wouldn't take you long to realize that method 1 is a big no-no. After all, you wouldn't want to heat up your body strongly with acid. Right? That wouldn't just break down maltose to glucose, that would also break down your entire body. So how does our body break down maltose to glucose? Well, it does so by having maltase enzyme. So there is maltase enzyme in our digestive system that helps to break down maltose to glucose at room temperature. So why do we need enzymes? Well, it's so that we can speed up chemical reactions at room temperature, right? So that's one of the advantages that enzymes gives the body. And related to that, you might want to think about what the advantages and disadvantages of using a biological washing powder compared to a non-biological one is. And we can discuss this more in class. But for now, let's look at how do enzymes work. And to understand how enzymes work, we must first get comfortable with this concept called activation energy. And you need to know this concept well. So what is activation energy? It is the amount of energy needed to start a chemical reaction. Now, all chemical reactions require activation energy to start. So for example, we were looking at this chemical reaction where maltose, the reactant, breaks down into glucose, the product. And what you see here on the vertical axis is the amount of energy that the substances have. So originally, the reactants have this amount of energy. Maltose has this amount of energy. And when you heat it up, it gains energy. Heat it up hot enough, it gains enough energy up at this point that it is able to then break down into glucose. So how much energy is needed for maltose to start breaking down? Well, it's represented by this arrow here. This is the amount of energy needed to start the reaction, and so we call this amount of energy the activation energy. Now the problem is that this activation energy is usually quite large, right? That's why we have to heat up maltose a lot in order to get it to break down. So what can be done? How can enzymes help? Now enzymes help speed up the reaction by providing an alternative pathway of reaction with a lower activation energy. As we saw just now, this was the activation energy when there was no enzyme, right? And there was a lot of energy required to get maltose to break down. Now when you add an enzyme, and in this case we are adding maltase, then what happens is that you create an alternative pathway of reaction. So now maltose, instead of taking this pathway, can take this pathway. And this alternative pathway, you realize, has a much lower activation energy. So with the enzyme, there's now a pathway with a lower activation energy. And maltose can take this pathway to break down into glucose. So less energy is required, and we can actually get maltose to break down at room temperature. So that's how enzymes help to speed up the reaction. Now importantly, take note that the original pathway of reaction still exists. So now there are just two pathways, but one pathway has a lower energy requirement. So another way of thinking about it is that you can think of an enzyme, a catalyst, as a tunnel through the mountain. Right? So initially this guy here had to push the stone up over to the top of the mountain in order for it to come down. But now with a catalyst, there's an alternative pathway of reaction where a lot less energy is needed to get from A to B. So that's what an enzyme does. Well, now that we've talked about how enzymes work, we're going to finish off by talking about what kind of reactions do enzymes catalyze. Now, the first type of reaction that enzymes catalyze are reactions that build up substances. And we call these kind of reactions anabolic reactions. So reactions that build up complex substances from simple ones. So for example, we have the synthesizing of protein from amino acids, right? Complex proteins being built up from amino acids. Now, where does this take place? Can you remember from your cells chapter? Right, it takes place on our ribosomes. Okay, but you would need enzymes to help speed up this reaction in the cell. Now, the other kind of reaction that enzymes catalyze are reactions where complex substances are broken down. So enzymes catalyze reactions that break down complex substances. So we have already seen an example of that when we saw maltose being broken down to glucose, and the enzyme maltase helped to speed that up. Now this takes place, of course, in our digestive system, where we've got lots of breaking down of complex substances. So yeah, the example, digestion. For example, starch being hydrolyzed into maltose or glucose, or what we saw at the start in the video, hydrogen peroxide being broken down to oxygen and water, and this is sped up by the enzyme catalase, which incidentally is what is found in your blood, right? And that is why adding the blood helps speed up the breakdown of hydrogen peroxide. Now, just a final point that we can name enzymes by the kind of reactions that they catalyze. So for example, an enzyme that catalyzes hydrolysis, so whether it's hydrolysis of starch, or hydrolysis of maltose, or hydrolysis of proteins, if you are an enzyme that catalyzes hydrolysis, you'll be a hydrolase. You're called a hydrolase. Now, hydrolases can be further categorized based on the kind of substance that they hydrolyze, that they break down. So for example, carbohydrases would act on carbohydrates. Proteases would act on, proteins. And lipases will act on fats, right? Or what we call lipids. So with this in mind, just a last question to end off. What kind of enzyme is maltase? Right, maltase acts on maltose, which is a carbohydrate. So maltase is a carbohydrate. I can't spell. Carbohydrates. Right. Okay, that's all for this lesson. Just brush up on what an enzyme is, how it works, what it does to activation energy, and what kind of reactions do enzymes catalyze. And we'll see you in the next lesson to talk even more about enzymes.